I am about to relate the most memorable of all wars that were ever waged. The war which the Carthaginians, under the conduct of Hannibal, maintained with the Roman people. The Roman historian Livy etched these words some 2,000 years ago, before he went on to describe the greatest war ever to hit the Mediterranean by his own lifetime. The Second Punic War saw Rome mobilize enormous armies several times throughout the conflict in an effort to fight in multiple theaters of war. Fielding more than 500,000 men into the legions throughout the course of the conflict showcases the size and scale of Rome's military capability, something that was possible as a result of our alliance system on the Italian peninsula. However, Rome would go on to lose some 300,000 soldiers killed in battle throughout this 17-year conflict. Dozens of towns and cities would be sacked or destroyed, with notable places like Capua, Syracuse, and Tarentum falling victim to attack. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the fighting across Italy, southern France, Spain, North Africa, and the western Mediterranean islands. The size and scale of fighting was truly striking, even if it had been a conflict in the modern age. This is Rome Retold, with your host, Tim. Let's now continue on our quest into the history of ancient Rome. After the fall of Saguntum in 219 BC, it was now open war between Carthage and Rome. The Romans believed they had time on their side, with Hannibal's army still in Iberia, and they set about levying a citizen soldier army as they had done many times in the past. Believing it would take Hannibal some time to finish up business in Spain before he could get moving again, the Romans planned to mobilize an army, then stop Hannibal somewhere in southern France before he ever even had a chance to cross over the Alps into Italy. However, Hannibal guessed that this was exactly the Romans' plan, and so he set his army on the move shortly after sacking Saguntum. After nearly 20 years of war in Iberia, Hannibal set off with a massive army of close to 100,000 battle-hardened men. To be successful, Hannibal knew that time was of the essence, and his sight remained fixed on Rome and revenge. Wanting to get over the Alps and into Italy before the Romans could stop him, Hannibal set his army off at breakneck speed. The Carthaginians crossed the Pyrenees Mountains into southern France and headed east, making it to the Rhone River in summer 218 BC. Throughout their march, the army plundered the countryside, as armies tend to do, and this brought the various Gallic tribes to arms. Now, these Celtic men had been shadowing Hannibal's army and fighting skirmishes here and there as the Carthaginians marched along. At the Rhone River, these tribesmen banded together and attempted to stop Hannibal's advance once and for all, hoping to send his interloping army back where it came from. Hannibal had no real intention of fighting a bunch of Gallic tribesmen on the Rhone River in 218 BC, because he was simply trying to make it into Italy as quickly as he could. But fate was going to test him early. The Gallic warriors stood on the east side of the river opposite the Carthaginians. So Hannibal not only had to figure out how to cross an entire army, complete with horses and elephants, across a formidable river, but they had to do it with an enemy army standing ready to attack them on the opposite bank. Now, this required some careful planning and consideration. And then the pressure mounted even more once Hannibal began hearing rumors that he also had a Roman army to his rear. Although it did take the Romans time to get their army together, They managed to speed things up by sailing this army from Italy to southern France once it was formed. However, not knowing where Hannibal was at the time, they actually overshot things and they landed further west to his rear. Obtaining information from the locals once they landed, the Romans began moving east to close with the Carthaginians. All of this was done in good order, as the Roman army was led by one of the consuls for that year, who was a man named Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the future Scipio Africanus. So Hannibal was now stuck between a rock and a hard place, but this was not the first nor the last time this would happen to him. Hannibal devised a plan and quickly set it into motion. He sent a select group of soldiers a ways upriver and told them to cross by any means possible. Afterwards, they were to head back downriver and hide themselves to the rear of the Gallic army. Hannibal told them he would give them 2 days to accomplish all of this, and then, on the second day, they were to light a smoke signal before attacking the Gauls from the rear. Hannibal wished these men good luck, then sent them on their way. Now, while they were waiting for these 2 days to pass, Hannibal set his army to constructing as many rafts and boats as they could possibly manage. On the morning of the second day, Hannibal roused his army and directed them to make as much noise and commotion as possible, hoping to draw the Gauls' attention away from their rear and onto his men along the river. As the morning wore on, Hannibal eventually saw the smoke signal he'd been waiting for, and he quickly ushered his men into their boats. In the end, the timing was perfect, and the Carthaginians caught the Gallic warriors from both sides. The tribesmen were attacked from the rear by the detachment of soldiers Hannibal had sent around 2 days before, and as the rest of the army crossed the river and climbed onto the banks of the shore. After the fighting ended, Hannibal still had to move the animals across. Although the horses could swim, the elephants required some more creative thinking. Hannibal had several large rafts tied together, and dirt was spread all along the top to make it look like solid ground. But the elephants were still wary of walking onto the unsteady raft, so one last solution was required. A female elephant was allegedly coaxed onto the raft first, and afterward the Carthaginians found it possible to get all of the other male elephants on. Now, either way, Hannibal was able to get his army across, and then they marched to the base of the Alpine mountains, leaving Scipio and his army behind. The Romans couldn't really hope to fight the Carthaginians once they reached the mountains, so upon learning that Hannibal had made it across the Rhone River, the Romans sailed back to Italy and prepared to meet Hannibal there. Although Hannibal had moved with speed, it did come at a cost. Overall, Hannibal lost almost 40,000 men to death and desertion when crossing the Pyrenees and through southern France. Now that's a 40% loss of his entire army in just a few short months, and he hasn't even fought the Romans yet. Although Hannibal would begin his ascent into the Alps with 60,000 men and 37 elephants, his losses had only just begun. It would take Hannibal's army only 15 days to cross the Alps, moving from southern France into northern Italy. But to the Carthaginian army, it would feel like 15 years. They were continually harassed at every turn by more Gallic tribesmen who used hit-and-run tactics, launching arrows and even rock slides at them from the mountainsides. They picked away at the extended marching line with ambush after ambush. At one point, the Carthaginians even became trapped by a sudden autumn snowstorm in the mountains, and this killed countless men and animals as well. Although Hannibal began his ascent of the Alps with 60,000 soldiers and 37 elephants, he would come out the other side only 15 days later with just 26,000 men, and absolutely no elephants survived. This means that Hannibal lost another 34,000 men. Adding it all up when he began in Iberia, Hannibal's army had gone from 100,000 soldiers down to 26,000, meaning he had lost almost 75% of his total fighting force, all without having fought a single battle against Rome. Although he had achieved the speed he desired, things were now looking extremely grim for Hannibal. But we all probably know this wasn't the end of the story. So let's see how he managed to turn things around. The Roman consul Scipio had originally been sent with his army to Gaul with orders to intercept and block Hannibal's army. He had landed in the city of Massilia, which is now modern-day Marseille, only to find out he was already too late. By late 218 BC, Scipio was back in Italy, and in November, Hannibal had made it over the Alps. Scipio was determined to prevent Hannibal's advance, and so he promptly moved to block him. The two nations would eventually have their first battle of the Second War under these circumstances, and although this battle proved to be a minor cavalry skirmish, I think it was foreboding of how the war to come would be, a deadly back-and-forth struggle. This battle was fought along the Ticinus River, and it is therefore known as the Battle of the Ticinus River. The fighting went from morning into midday, and the course of the battle ebbed and flowed like the river it was fought along. Eventually, the Carthaginians gained the upper hand, and the Roman cavalry found themselves in a desperate fight. They were eventually pushed into the river itself, and even the consul Scipio found himself fighting for his life as the water rushed all around him. But it wasn't over yet. A young man of 17 years was sitting on a nearby hilltop with a personal bodyguard of cavalry, and as he saw events unfold, he sprung into action. He and his men charged into the battle on the river, scattering the Carthaginian cavalry and ending the fighting for the day. Afterward, the consul Scipio was able to give this young man a warm embrace, because he was none other than his own son and the future Scipio Africanus. For saving his fellow Romans that day, including his own father's life, the young Scipio was awarded the Corona Civica, or the Civic Crown. This was a military award like the Medal of Honor or the Victoria Cross today, and was one of the highest military achievements someone could earn in ancient Rome. Now, despite this award, though, the young Scipio actually refused it and stated the action was one that rewarded itself. Although the day was saved, it is typically viewed as an overall defeat for the Romans, as they lost a large portion of their cavalry, and the army was forced to retreat from the area. Now, the year was almost over, and winter was coming, so Scipio managed to build a fortified camp along the river Trebia on strong defensive ground. There he waited for several weeks to recover from his wounds and receive reinforcements from Rome. A second army soon joined Scipio's, led by the elder consul for the year of 218 BC by a man named Sempronius Longus. Although we don't know exactly what wounds the consul Scipio had received during the battle of the Ticinus River, we are told by Polybius that he needed some time to recover, and that Sempronius took over command of the combined army. Sempronius would prove to be an impulsive and reckless commander, and this is something that Hannibal quickly discovered for himself and then exploited. One day, the Carthaginians sent out a small cavalry force to harass the Roman working parties, attacking any soldiers that were foraging for food or gathering water from the nearby river. Sempronius responded to this by quickly rushing more Roman troops onto the field to scatter the Carthaginians. But Polybius tells us this was done in a hurried and haphazard way. Even still, the Carthaginians were forced to retreat toward their own nearby camp, where they then received reinforcements themselves. The battle ebbed back toward the Roman camp again as they became outnumbered, until Sempronius again sent another hasty group of reinforcements, pushing the Carthaginians back for a second time. Now, this back and forth was how many ancient battles turned from skirmish into slaughter, and this engagement was quickly escalating in size and number. Hannibal was wary of being drawn into a battle he was not completely prepared for, however, and at this stage he broke his men off from all the fighting. From this skirmish, Hannibal surmised, and correctly, that Sempronius was an impetuous and reckless commander, one who would easily be enticed into battle. Hannibal now only needed to carefully lay a trap, and he knew that Sempronius would stray headlong into it. He sent his scouts to fully reconnoiter the area around the Roman camp, instructing them to take note of every minor tree and shrub. When they returned with their report, Hannibal found he was able to concoct the perfect plan. It was now late December, 218 BC, and a light snow was falling across the plain in which the two armies were situated. The river Trebia ran between the Roman and Carthaginian encampments, although there was a natural crossing situated nearby. Hannibal set about using all of this to his advantage on a particularly cold and blustery morning. As had happened in the previous skirmish, Hannibal sent his cavalry forward to harass the Roman soldiers that were out collecting the day's water and food. But on this particular morning, Hannibal and his entire army were prepared for battle. Sempronius, as he had done the last time, rushed out his own cavalry to fight off the Carthaginians. But instead of engaging in a skirmish, as they had previously done, the Carthaginians immediately beat a hasty retreat. Sempronius believed the Carthaginians were finally beginning to tire of the fighting. He felt assured they were losing heart in their hopeless standoff, and that he thought now was the time to press the Roman advantage. Sempronius hurriedly called his entire army and rushed them out onto the field to prepare for battle. But since it was still early morning, many of the Romans had not even had their breakfast, and many were even roused from sleeping to get up and form ranks. This all meant that the legions hurried out onto the snowy plains in a confused disarray. But Sempronius was not deterred. He quickly ordered his army to cross the river with all due haste, hoping to keep the pressure on the retreating Carthaginian cavalry and press the advantage he believed he had against Hannibal's main army. Now, all of this happened even though Hannibal's army was completely formed up on the opposite side of the river. But somehow, Sempronius believed his enemy had lost the will to fight, and that today was his chance for glory. Or perhaps he was too proud to call the Romans back into camp, or perhaps he believed they somehow could find a way to win by attacking. With his consulship ending in less than a month, and his military command along with it, it seems Sempronius was going to take any chance he could to win himself some glory and fame, no matter what the odds were. So, the Romans began to wade across the freezing river, which was running chest-high on the morning of battle. The Carthaginians, alternatively, had planned and laid this trap well in advance, and had been up and ready before the sun even rose. They found themselves warm and rested, with bellies full of food, as they watched their foe struggle against the swift and cold current. Hannibal didn't even bother to attack the Romans while they struggled across. He was content to leave each legionary in the cold waters as long as he could. Hannibal wanted them to struggle across and lose the safety of their own shore, thereby cutting them off from an easy retreat back to camp. Once the Romans finally forded the river and formed ranks, They were freezing, hungry, and incredibly tired. As the two armies stood squared off, a muffled breeze fluttered the air, and large, thick flakes continued to flutter down among the men standing in the valley. The call for attack finally came down the line, and the two armies simultaneously engaged. The battle proved to be an even match, despite the pitiful conditions which the Romans had begun. The Carthaginians were stronger in light troops and cavalry, and they had managed to swing around the flanks of the Romans, closing them in a U formation, with the Romans' backs to the river. The Roman flanks were crumbling and beginning to fold in on the center, and it looked as if they might be completely surrounded. But despite this seemingly fatal maneuver, the Roman heavy infantry held the line and soon even began cutting their way through the center of the Carthaginian army. Although they were nearly enveloped, the Romans actually managed to break straight through the Carthaginian center, splitting Hannibal's army completely in two. The Romans now found themselves to the rear of Hannibal's army, and in moments they were ready to turn and begin slashing the Carthaginians from behind. It seemed that hard fighting and luck was actually on Sempronius' side, and it looked as though the Romans had snatched victory from the jaws of defeat. This opportunity gave them the chance to slaughter Hannibal's entire army and send the remnants limping back home through the Alps. The last hopeless survivors would probably be hunted down and slaughtered by the angry tribal Celts they had previously left behind, men who would have been happy to see them return in defeat. As the Romans crashed through the center of the Carthaginian line, Sempronius was probably envisioning the most glorious triumph in Roman history. He would be praised as the greatest Roman who had ever lived, the man who had saved Italy from the scourge of Hannibal. But then a loud horn pierced the air, and all of their dreams vanished. Now that is because the night before the battle, Hannibal had secretly placed 2,000 Gallic warriors in a nearby swamp that was full of low scrub and brush. These men had remained hidden all night and into the morning, and had only emerged at the critical point of the battle. By the time the Roman infantry could take advantage of their great breakthrough at the Carthaginian center, this hidden force was crashing into the Roman rear, sending the entire army into a complete and immediate rout. Hannibal had managed to save his army just in the nick of time, and now his army began the slaughter. The Romans recrossed the river in a panicked frenzy, attempting to find safety, yet most found none. Thousands were slaughtered in the ensuing retreat, and only a lucky few made it back to the Roman fort in one piece. Although the exact number of losses is debated by historians, estimates place them somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 Romans killed out of the original 40,000, meaning that somewhere between 50 and 75% of Rome's army was lost. Hannibal had lost only a few thousand men of his own, and so the Battle of Trebia showcased Hannibal's first resounding success in Italy. Most accounts agree that only about 10,000 Roman soldiers remained as an effective fighting force after the battle, and what remnants survived retreated to a nearby town named Placentia. It was still only the first year of the war, and Hannibal had already managed to defeat a combined consular army on Italian soil. Rome's consular armies represented her finest fighting force of citizen soldiers that could be mustered, and its resounding defeat sent shockwaves throughout the peninsula. The Romans quickly learned they were up against a new and formidable commander, and here Hannibal displayed his first clear instance of his tactical abilities. He demonstrated he took great care in assessing the personal attributes of his opposing commander, and that he could use any weak point to his own advantage. These pre-battle methods would be repeated by Hannibal multiple times throughout his Italian campaign. He remained diligent in assessing his opponent's temperament, and he was quick to implement trickery so as to surprise his enemy and turn the tide of battle when it counted most. As we draw the curtain on the cold and tumultuous waters of the Trebia River, we see a clear victory from Hannibal, although it would not be his last. The war was far from over, and the Romans still had a long and arduous struggle left ahead of them. In our next episode, we'll journey to the shores of Lake Trasimene, where once more the fate of Rome was tested. The specter of defeat would never loom larger, and the lessons learned were never more important. But the tides of war are ever changing, and the greatest battles are not just fought on the fields of glory, but also within the heart of those who seek to rise above.